The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the ground was wet from the morning rain. A small grave was dug in the lonely field outside the village. The alien girl stood there, her body shaking from cold and grief. She wore a thin black cloak, the kind given to widows, but no one stood beside her. The village was silent, the streets empty. No neighbors came, no relatives came, not even her husband's clan. She was alone, except for the sound of the wind that whistled through the tall grass. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands clutched a small piece of cloth that had once belonged to her husband. She stared at the grave. The earth was fresh, and the shovel still leaned nearby. Her heart hurt with every beat. She thought to herself, how could a man who gave his life for their people be forgotten so quickly? How could his sacrifice mean nothing? She wanted to scream at the world, to demand why no one came, but her voice refused to leave her throat. All she could do was let silent tears fall onto the ground. Her husband had been a soldier. He had left their home with courage in his chest and fire in his eyes. He had fought to protect their planet from invaders. But now, as his body lay beneath the dirt, not a single fellow soldier came to honor him. It was as if he had never existed. She clenched the cloth tighter and whispered, "You deserved more than this." The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, steady, and slow, they came closer and closer from behind her. She froze. For a moment, she thought maybe one of her husband's kin had finally come. She turned her head slightly, her eyes filled with both hope and anger. But what she saw made her breath catch. It was not one of her kind. It was a human. He was tall, his uniform worn and scarred. His boots were covered with mud, his shoulders bent as if carrying a great weight. His face was tired, his eyes shadowed, but in them burned something she had not seen all day. Respect. Without saying a word, the human soldier walked past her and stopped before the grave. He held something in his hand, a silver medal that glinted faintly under the dull sky. Slowly, carefully, he knelt and placed the medal on the dirt. His hand lingered there for a moment, his head bowed. The alien girl's eyes widened. She had never met him before, yet here he was, showing more honor than her own people. She felt confusion mix with her sorrow. Who was this man? Why would a human care? The soldier's lips moved, but his words were soft, almost like a prayer meant only for the dead. She caught fragments, pieces of his voice carried by the wind. "You saved me. I won't forget. I'm still here because of you." The words hit her heart like a blade. She realized this man had fought beside her husband. He was not just another soldier, he was his partner in battle. The human finally rose to his feet. He turned his head slightly, and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. The girl's lips trembled. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but no sound left her mouth. His gaze held sorrow, but also strength, as if he carried not just his own grief, but hers too. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I owed him everything. That debt does not end with his death." Her heart pounded. She did not understand his words fully, but she felt their weight. She looked back at the empty field, the silent village. Anger burned inside her chest. Why had her people abandoned her husband's memory? Why had they abandoned her? And yet, this stranger, this human, stood here alone when no one else dared. The girl wiped her tears roughly, ashamed of her weakness in front of him. But he did not look at her with pity. His expression was firm, almost protective. She tried to speak, but only one question came out, her voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The soldier looked at the grave again. His jaw tightened, and after a long pause, he answered, "Because he was my brother, though not by blood. He fought for me, and I will honor him until my last breath." The words made her knees weak. She nearly fell, but she caught herself. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm the storm inside. No one had said such things today. No one had shown such loyalty. She realized her husband had carried secrets into battle, bonds she had never known, friendships she had never seen. This human's presence told her that her husband's life had meaning beyond what her people were willing to admit. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the grave. The metal shone against the dark soil, a symbol of something deeper than family or tradition, something pure, something eternal. For the first time that day, she felt her loneliness ease just a little. Someone else grieved with her. Someone else remembered him. The human soldier stood silently for a moment longer, then stepped back, his boots pressing into the wet earth. He did not leave, but neither did he intrude. He seemed to understand that the widow needed space, but also that she should not face this grief entirely alone. His presence was like a quiet wall against the emptiness. She turned her eyes once more to the grave, and in her heart she whispered, "You are not forgotten." The human's arrival had changed something. The funeral that began with silence no longer felt completely abandoned. It was still lonely, still painful, but it now carried a flicker of honor, a faint but powerful reminder that her husband's sacrifice lived on in the heart of at least one man. And for her, that meant everything. The human soldier's hand stayed on the grave for a long time, as if he was speaking with the man buried beneath the earth. The alien widow stood silently, her breath uneven, her heart beating too fast. She wanted to step closer, to hear every word, but her body felt frozen. When the soldier finally straightened, his hand lingered on the dirt for one last moment before he let it go. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out another medal, older and scratched, its edges worn by years of battle. He held it carefully, almost reverently, and placed it beside the fresh one he had already laid down. His voice was low, steady but heavy with grief. "This belonged to him," he whispered, "but he gave it to me once. Said I should carry it until the day I no longer needed his strength. Now, it's time it rests with him again." The widow's lips parted in shock. She stared at the medal glinting faintly in the gray light, then at the human's face. His expression was carved with pain, but behind it was something else: respect, loyalty, a bond she could not understand. She had never seen a soldier of her people honor the dead in this way. Her voice finally broke through her trembling chest. "You knew him?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. The human turned his eyes to her. For a moment, he did not speak. Then he gave a small nod. "I knew him better than most. He saved my life more times than I can count. We fought together, side by side, against fire, against death itself. He was my partner, my brother." His words came slowly, each one pulled from a place of deep sorrow. The widow's knees weakened. She wanted to sit, but she forced herself to stand. "Then why are you the only one here?" Her voice cracked. "His people, his commanders, his friends, they abandoned him. Why is it only you, a human, who remembers him?" The soldier's jaw tightened. His eyes shifted to the horizon, where the clouds hung low and dark. "Because sometimes," he said, his tone heavy with unspoken truth, "the ones closest to us turn away when truth becomes inconvenient. But I carry a debt to him, a debt no one else understands." He looked back at her, his eyes sharp but kind. "I live because of him. Every breath I take is a gift he gave me. I will never forget that, and I will not let his memory be buried in silence." The widow felt tears gather again in her eyes, but this time they were different. Not just grief, but a strange spark of warmth. Someone else carried the same pain she bore. Someone else stood in the same shadow of loss. She looked at the human, at the strong set of his shoulders, at the sadness carved into his face, and she felt something shift inside her chest. The soldier stepped closer to the grave, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. He lowered his head again, his voice almost breaking as he spoke softly to the earth. "I swear to you, my brother, I will watch over what you left behind. Your fight isn't forgotten, and neither is she." His words made the widow's breath catch. She realized he was talking about her. She stepped forward quickly, her hand half raised as if to stop him. What do you mean?" He looked at her then, straight into her eyes. His voice was steady, but filled with a quiet fire. "I owed him my life. Now I owe you." Her mouth went dry. The wind seemed to stop around her. She blinked, trying to understand what he had just said. No one had ever spoken such words to her before. No one had ever promised her anything since her husband's death. She shook her head slowly, whispering, "You don't even know me." The human gave a faint, sad smile, though his eyes held no trace of mockery. "I didn't know you before, but I knew him, and through him, I know what you meant to him. That's enough." The widow felt her heart twist painfully. Memories of her husband filled her mind, the nights he left for war, the promises he made, the way he carried hope even in darkness. And now, standing before her, was the man who had fought beside him, who carried the last pieces of his unspoken story. She wanted to ask so much. She wanted to know what her husband's final moments were, whether he had spoken of her, whether he had suffered. But she could not find the strength to form the words. The human must have sensed her silence. He took a step back, giving her space. "I know this is not what you wanted today," he said gently, "but I couldn't let him be buried alone. He deserves better. And you deserve to know you were never forgotten by him." Her eyes widened at those words. He? He spoke of me? The human nodded slowly. "Every time we thought the battle was lost, he spoke of you. Said your face was the reason he kept moving. He believed he would see you again, no matter what. That belief gave him strength. It gave me strength too." The widow pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to silence the sob that escaped. She turned away, her tears falling fast, but her heart clung to the image of her husband in those final days, still thinking of her, still carrying her in his soul. She felt both pain and comfort at once, like a wound that burned but also healed. The human soldier stood quietly, letting her grieve. He did not touch her, did not try to pull her into comfort. Instead, he remained as a silent guard, his presence strong but respectful. The metal on the grave glimmered faintly, a symbol of the promise he had made. As the clouds above finally broke and a light drizzle began to fall, the widow felt a strange certainty settle over her. She was no longer completely alone. Her husband's death had left a hole in her world, but this human, his battle partner, carried a piece of that world with him. His words, his promise echoed in her mind. I owed him my life. Now I owe you. And though she did not fully understand it yet, those words lit a spark inside her, a spark that would grow into something neither of them could have imagined. The night was quiet, but inside her heart there was no peace. The widow sat in the corner of her small house, staring at the dim light of the lantern. Her hands trembled as she held her husband's cloak, the one he had worn before leaving for war. The human soldier sat across from her, silent, his face half in shadow. He had come after the funeral, not forcing his presence, but simply sitting there, as if his being near gave her some kind of protection. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken. At last, she whispered, "He never told me anything about the war." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "He would smile when I asked, say everything was fine, but his eyes always carried something he never spoke." The soldier's head lifted slightly. His jaw clenched as if he wanted to answer, but struggled with the weight of the truth. She looked at him sharply. "You fought with him. You knew him better in those battles than I did here at home. Tell me, what happened to him out there?" The soldier did not reply at first. Instead, he rubbed a scar that cut across his forearm, his gaze distant, as though he was seeing ghosts. She leaned closer, her voice growing desperate. "Please, I need to know. Don't keep me in the dark like he did. Tell me." Finally, the human exhaled deeply, his voice low, almost reluctant. "We fought through fire and blood. There were days when death was so close I could smell it in every breath. And in all of it, your husband never wavered. He carried a strength none of us could match. When others broke, he stood. When I was too weak to move, he carried me on his back." His eyes flickered with memory. He was more than a soldier. He was a shield. Her eyes filled with tears. She gripped the cloak tighter. "Then why?" she whispered bitterly. "Why is he lying in the ground while you still breathe?" The words pierced him. His face tightened, and guilt washed across his features. He did not snap back, did not take offense. Instead, he lowered his gaze to the floor. "Because he chose me over himself." The widow froze. The lantern's flame flickered, throwing strange shadows across the room. "What do you mean?" The soldier hesitated, his lips pressed tight. For a long moment, he seemed to fight against speaking, but the widow's tear-streaked face demanded truth. Slowly, he said, "The day he died, it wasn't supposed to be his death." Her body went cold. She leaned forward, clutching the edge of the table. "Explain," she demanded. His eyes met hers, and they were full of pain. "We were surrounded, trapped. The enemy poured in from every side. I had taken a hit to my leg. I couldn't run. Your husband, he could have escaped. He had the chance. But he turned back. He lifted me, dragged me through the fire, through the screams. He knew what it meant. He knew the price." His voice broke, heavy with shame. "He gave himself so that I could live." The widow gasped, her breath shattering. The cloak slipped from her lap onto the floor. Her husband's last choice struck her like a blade. He had left her, but not by weakness, by sacrifice. She pressed her hand to her chest, unable to breathe. The soldier's hands curled into fists. "I begged him not to. I told him to save himself. But he only smiled. He said He said I had to live because someone had to remember. The widow's tears spilled freely now. She whispered, "He never told me. He never told me this." The soldier nodded slowly. "Because he didn't want you to carry the weight. That was who he was, always protecting, even in silence." He looked away, his voice darkening. "But there is more you should know. His death, it wasn't only the enemy's doing." Her head snapped up. "What are you saying?" His jaw tightened, and he seemed to hesitate again. "The commanders, they sent us into that fight knowing it was hopeless. They used us to buy time. He knew it, and still he went. He didn't tell you, because he wanted you to remember him as brave, not as someone betrayed by his own." The widow's hands shook violently. Betrayal burned inside her veins, hotter than the grief. Her people, her leaders, had thrown her husband into death like he was nothing but a tool. Rage boiled in her chest, mixing with despair. She stared at the human, her voice trembling with fury. "And you? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He lowered his head, shame covering him. "Because truth is a cruel burden. I wanted to spare you, but now I see you deserve to know everything." She rose from her seat, pacing the small room, her cloak brushing the floor. "They lied to me. They lied to all of us. They buried him with silence, with no honor, because if they admitted what happened, they would have to admit their crime." The soldier watched her with sorrow. He did not move, but his presence was steady, like a pillar holding up the room. "Yes, they left him to die, and me with him. But he refused. He gave me life, and I carry it now in his name." The widow stopped, her shoulders heaving, her hands clenched into fists. She turned toward the grave outside, though the walls blocked her view. Her heart screamed with questions, with pain. But among the storm of emotions, one thing became clear. Her husband's last act was not just death, it was choice. He had chosen loyalty. He had chosen to save a human over saving himself. She turned back to the soldier. For the first time, her anger softened just enough to let the grief show. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "In his last moments, did he suffer?" The human's face softened. He shook his head slowly. "No, he fought until the end. His eyes were steady, and the last word he spoke was your name." Her knees gave way, and she sank to the ground, covering her face with her hands. The truth cut her open, but it also gave her something precious, the knowledge that she had lived in his heart until his final breath. The soldier did not approach, did not break her grief. He simply sat in silence, guarding her pain as if it were sacred. The lantern's flame flickered again, throwing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind carried the sound of leaves rustling, like whispers of the dead. And in that quiet night, two souls sat together, bound not by blood, but by the memory of a man who had given everything. The widow sat still, her hands pressed tightly against her lap, her eyes red and swollen. The human's words echoed in her head again and again. The commanders knew. They sent him to die. Her body trembled with both sorrow and rage. She could not believe it, yet deep down she knew it was true. She had seen the way her husband returned from missions, bruised and scarred, with pain in his eyes that he never explained. He had carried secrets, and now the human had opened them like old wounds. She looked at the soldier across from her. His shoulders were heavy, his face hard, but his eyes carried no lies. He had nothing to gain by telling her this, and that made the truth even harder to bear. Her voice broke as she asked, "So, he was never meant to come back? They used him?" The human gave a slow nod, his jaw clenched as if every word tasted bitter. "Yes, he knew it too. He didn't speak of it, but I saw it in his eyes that day. He understood what they were doing, but he didn't stop. He walked into that battle knowing it was his end." Her heart twisted painfully. She could almost see her husband's face in her memory, the way he smiled before leaving, the way he touched her hand and promised he would return. That promise had been a lie, not his lie, but the commander's lie. They had stolen even his final words from her, forcing him to hide the truth so she would not drown in despair. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but anger rose with them. She slammed her hand against the table, the sound sharp in the silence. How could they? He gave everything for them, and they betrayed him. They let him die like an animal in the dirt. Her voice shook with fury. The human did not flinch at her rage. Instead, he lowered his head. "That is the way of war," he said softly. "Leaders sacrifice soldiers like pieces on a board, but your husband was not a piece. He was a man, a hero, and they feared the truth that his death was their doing. The widow's chest burned. She felt her grief transforming into something darker, heavier. She whispered through clenched teeth, they buried him in silence with no honor, because if they honored him, people would ask questions. The soldier's eyes met hers, and there was fire in his gaze. Yes. And if they know you have learned this, they will silence you too. Her breath caught. Fear slid into her heart, sharp and cold. She looked at the door, half expecting soldiers to come bursting in. Me? She whispered. The soldier leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You are his widow. If you begin to ask questions, if you tell others what really happened, they will see you as a danger. They will not allow the truth to spread. They will not hesitate to remove you. Her blood ran cold. For a moment, she felt the walls closing in around her. She had already lost her husband. Now they might try to take her too. She hugged herself tightly, her whole body shaking. Then, what am I supposed to do? Stay silent? Pretend I know nothing? The human's expression hardened. For now, yes. Survive. Live. Do not let them know what you have learned. If you fall, then his sacrifice means nothing. You are the last piece of him left in this world. Protect that, even if it means carrying this truth alone. She shook her head violently, her tears falling onto her cloak. Alone. I can't carry this alone. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, a broken cry from the depth of her chest. The soldier's voice softened, though it carried unshakable strength. You are not alone. I was there. I saw it. And as long as I breathe, I will carry it with you. Her eyes lifted slowly to him, searching his face. For the first time, she felt something beyond grief. She felt the strange warmth of not being abandoned. Her husband was gone, but this man, his battle partner, stood with her in the silence of betrayal. But her anger returned, fierce and burning. They will pay for this, she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. They think they can bury the truth, but I will not let them. The soldier's eyes narrowed. He understood her pain, but he also understood the danger better than she did. If you move too soon, you will join him in the grave. Do not let anger blind you. Choose carefully when to speak and when to remain silent. That is how you will survive long enough to make his sacrifice matter. Her chest heaved, torn between vengeance and survival. She wanted to scream, to march to the commanders and demand justice. But she also remembered the way her husband looked at her before leaving, the way his eyes begged her to live even if he did not. She sank back into her chair, trembling, her fists still clenched, but her fire dimmed. The human rose slowly to his feet, his shadow stretched across the room, tall and solid. He looked down at her with eyes that carried the same grief she bore, and said quietly, I will not let them erase him. I will not let them erase you. But you must be careful. For his sake. The widow lowered her head, her tears dripping onto the table. She whispered, for his sake. Her heart ached with fury, with sorrow, but also with a fragile thread of resolve. Outside, the night deepened, and the sound of the wind carried through the cracks of the house. The truth now weighed heavy in her chest, heavier than grief itself. Her husband had died not only in battle, but also as a victim of betrayal. And now, she too carried that secret, a dangerous truth that could cost her life. But as she looked at the human soldier standing guard before her, she felt the faintest spark of strength. She was not as alone as she thought, and though fear gripped her, she knew this was only the beginning. The truth was a fire, and once lit, it could never be completely hidden. The days after the funeral passed slowly, filled with silence and heavy air. The widow woke each morning with swollen eyes and an empty heart. Her husband's cloak still hung by the door, untouched, and sometimes she caught herself staring at it, waiting for him to return. But only the wind entered, carrying dust and loneliness into her home. She had no one to turn to, no family close enough to care, and no neighbors who dared to speak with her. Everyone avoided her as though grief was a curse. Yet, there was one who came back, the human soldier. At first, he stood quietly outside her door, leaving food or water without saying much. Then, slowly, he began to help with small things. When her roof leaked, he climbed up and repaired it with steady hands. When the firewood was too heavy for her, he carried it in without being asked. His presence was not loud or demanding. It was steady, like a shield against the emptiness. The widow found herself watching him with cautious eyes. She did not understand why he remained. He had no duty to her, no blood ties, no reason except the promise he had spoken at the grave. And yet he came. At first, she wanted to push him away. His presence reminded her of her husband, of the life she had lost. But each time she saw the quiet respect in his eyes, she could not bring herself to send him off. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in red and gold, she sat outside her home. The soldier worked nearby, mending a broken fence. She watched his hands, strong and practiced, moving with patience. She thought of her husband, who once fixed the same fence, laughing when the posts leaned too far. The memory stabbed her heart, and she whispered bitterly, "He should have been here, not you." The soldier paused but did not look offended. He drove the post into the ground and said softly, "I know. I wish it was him too." His voice carried such honesty that her anger melted into sorrow. She lowered her head, ashamed of her words. Later that night, as they shared a meal in silence, she finally spoke again. "Why do you stay?" Her eyes stayed on the bowl in her hands, afraid to meet his gaze. The soldier looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because he saved me, and because he loved you. When I see you, I see his last wish, to keep you safe. If I walk away, then I betray him." Her chest tightened. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight heavier than stone. She lifted her eyes slowly, seeing no pity in him, only loyalty. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than despair. It was not happiness, but it was a thread of connection, a reminder that she was not left to face the world alone. As days turned into weeks, she noticed more. The soldier fixed the tools her husband had left broken. He repaired the door that creaked in the wind. When storms came, he sat near the fire to keep watch, ensuring she was safe through the night. He never asked for thanks, never sought reward. His actions spoke louder than words, each one saying, "You are not abandoned." The widow found herself talking more. She shared small things, memories of her husband, fragments of laughter, moments of pain. The soldier listened quietly, never interrupting, never dismissing. His silence was not empty, it was full of respect, as though every word she spoke was a treasure he guarded. One night, she asked him if her husband ever spoke about her during the battles. The soldier nodded, his face softening. "Always. When the fighting was darkest, he would tell me about your smile. He said it gave him strength when his body was too tired to move." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they carried warmth. To know she had been his light even on the battlefield gave her comfort she never expected to feel. She pressed her hands to her chest, whispering, "He carried me with him." The soldier gave a faint smile. "Yes, and now I see the same strength in you." The widow looked away quickly, her cheeks hot. Strength? She felt broken, fragile, like a shadow of the woman she once was. Yet the soldier's words stayed with her, echoing in her heart long after the fire burned low. Slowly, a bond began to grow between them. It was not spoken, not defined, but it was real. She began to rely on his presence, just as he seemed to draw purpose from hers. When danger stirred in the distance, bandits roaming, whispers of soldiers seeking silence, she felt safer knowing he was near. His loyalty was unshakable, and it wrapped around her like an invisible armor. But with this bond came a quiet fear. Each time he walked out to patrol the land or gather supplies, her heart raced. She feared losing him too, feared watching another grave being dug. She did not speak this fear, but it lingered inside her, a silent shadow she could not chase away. One evening, after a long day of repairs, she found herself standing closer to him than usual. The fire crackled between them, throwing sparks into the dark sky. She looked at him, his face lit by the flames, and whispered, "You don't have to stay forever." He looked back at her, his expression calm but steady. "I know," he said, "but until you no longer need me, I will not leave." Her heart trembled. She wanted to argue, to tell him she needed nothing, but the truth burned inside her. She needed him more than she dared to admit. As the night deepened, she lay awake, staring at the roof he had repaired. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel crushed by the silence. Instead, she felt the faint comfort of someone watching over her, someone carrying the same grief, someone strong enough to share the burden she thought she had to bear alone. The widow closed her eyes, and though her dreams were still filled with sorrow, they were no longer empty. Somewhere in the darkness, she carried the image of her husband's battle partner, the human who stood beside her now, unyielding, loyal, and bound by a promise that had already begun to change her life. The air in the village grew heavy with whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind brushing through the trees. Then they grew louder, sharper, and more dangerous. The widow heard them whenever she stepped outside. Hushed voices, eyes turning away, neighbors avoiding her gaze. They said she asked too many questions about her husband's death. They said she spent too much time with a human. The words stung, but more than that, they filled her with dread. She remembered the soldier's warning. If they know you discovered the truth, you'll be next. Each night, her sleep was shallow, broken by the sound of footsteps in her imagination. She would wake, clutching her cloak, afraid the door would burst open. But always in the darkness, the human was near. Sometimes she heard his boots pacing outside. Sometimes she glimpsed his silhouette by the fire. He stayed watch like a silent guard, his presence the only reason her fear did not consume her. One evening, as the sky turned deep blue and the stars began to appear, he came into her small house. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the shadows as though expecting danger to crawl from them. She asked softly, "What is it?" He sat down heavily, his voice low. "I heard men talking near the barracks. They know you've been asking. They don't like it. They're saying you're a problem." Her heart skipped, her chest tightening until it hurt to breathe. "What will they do to me?" she whispered. His eyes met hers, steady and sharp. "If they come, they won't come with words. They'll come with blades." Fear ran down her spine. She pressed her hands together, shaking. "Then what do I do?" He leaned closer, his tone firm but protective. "Stay close to me. Do not open the door at night. Do not trust anyone who comes to you suddenly. If they move against you, they'll have to get through me first." She stared at him, her eyes wide. He spoke with such certainty, as if his life had no value compared to hers. The memory of her husband's sacrifice burned in her chest. Once again, a human stood ready to risk everything for her. Tears welled up, but she forced them back. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Because he gave his life for me. If I let them take you, then his sacrifice means nothing." Her heart ached, but before she could answer, a sound broke the stillness. The door rattled as if something struck it from outside. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The soldier was on his feet in an instant, drawing the blade at his side. His body moved with calm precision, but his eyes burned with fire. The door rattled again, harder this time, followed by a voice, cold and cruel. "Widow, open the door. We have questions for you." Her blood froze. She looked at the human, panic in her eyes. He raised a hand, silently commanding her to stay back. His voice rang out, strong and unshaken. "She will not answer to cowards who come in the night. If you want her, you'll face me first." There was silence outside, then low murmurs. She clutched the edge of the table, her whole body trembling. Finally, the sound of retreating steps faded into the distance, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. The soldier locked the door firmly, then turned to her. His face was calm, but his chest rose and fell sharply. She whispered, "They'll come back." He nodded. "Yes, next time, stronger." She could not stop the tears now. They poured down her face as she whispered, "I cannot lose another man who protects me. First my husband, now you? I can't." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You will not lose me, not while I breathe." The words struck deep into her heart. She felt both fear and comfort. That, as if his promise was a fragile shield against a storm too large to see. She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing against his arm. He did not move away. That night, he refused to sleep. He sat by the fire with his blade across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door. She lay on her bed, but every time she opened her eyes, she saw him there, unmoving, like a wall between her and the world. For the first time in days, she felt the edge of her fear dull, replaced by a strange, unspoken trust. The next morning, the village was uneasy. People glanced at her door, but none dared approach while the humans stood outside. Children whispered about the stranger with fire in his eyes. Some of the elders frowned, but none confronted him. His presence alone was enough to keep them silent, at least for now. As days passed, the tension grew. Soldiers walked near her home more often, their eyes sharp, their whispers harsh. But the human never left her side. He hunted for food, repaired her walls, and stood watch each night. To her, he had become more than just her husband's partner. He was her shield, her anchor in a world that wanted her broken. One evening, when the sun bled red across the horizon, she found herself standing close to him once more. The fire crackled between them, and her voice came out trembling but steady. "Why do you risk your life for me? You could leave, vanish, and no one would blame you." He looked at her, his gaze unflinching. "Because I already carry his death. If I walk away from you too, then I carry his shame as well. And that I will never do." Her breath caught, her heart pounding. She lowered her eyes, her tears falling silently. She did not answer, but she understood. The night came again, with shadows long and heavy. Somewhere beyond the village, soldiers whispered of silencing her, but in her small home, the widow felt a spark of courage. She was not alone. Her husband's memory lived on, not only in her heart, but in the human's loyalty. And though the threat grew closer with each passing day, so too did the bond between them. Silent, unspoken, but powerful enough to change everything. The graveyard was quiet, touched by the pale light of dawn. The fresh earth where her husband lay was still dark and heavy, the metal resting on top of it, glimmering faintly with dew. The widow stood before it, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Beside her, the human soldier stood tall, silent as a stone. Days had passed since the night soldiers came to her door, and though danger still lingered in the air, something had changed. She was no longer standing at the grave alone. Her eyes burned as she whispered to the ground, "I thought you would be forgotten." But he would not let that happen. She glanced at the soldier next to her. His face was solemn, his eyes fixed on the earth. There was no arrogance in his presence, no attempt to claim honor for himself. He simply stood there, guarding the memory of the man who had once been his brother in arms. She remembered the first day of the funeral, when the field was empty, when loneliness had wrapped itself around her like chains. Now, even though grief still weighed heavy in her chest, she felt the strength of another heart beating beside her. It was not the same as before, but it was enough to remind her she was not abandoned. The soldier knelt by the grave. His hand brushed the metal, and his voice was low but firm. "I will not let them erase you. I will not let your sacrifice vanish into silence." Then he looked at the widow, his eyes steady. "And I will not let them erase her either." Her throat tightened. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting back the sob that threatened to escape. These words struck her deeply, not just because he honored her husband, but because he had tied her own fate to that vow. She felt the bond between them, fragile but unbreakable, like a thread of steel woven through her heart. They walked back toward her home together, the path lined with shadows of villagers watching from a distance. Whispers followed them, but no one dared step forward. The human's presence was like a shield around her, strong enough to silence even the boldest tongues. Still, she knew danger had not vanished. She could feel it in the air, sharp and bitter, like a storm waiting to break. Inside the house, as the fire burned low, she spoke in a trembling voice. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't know if they will try again." The soldier looked at her, his face calm, though his eyes carried the weight of war. "Whatever comes, we will face it. Together." Her heart stumbled at that word, together. She had lived in loneliness for so long, drowning in sorrow, but now that single word lit a spark inside her chest. She lowered her gaze, whispering, "I am afraid." He stepped closer, his voice softer. "So am I. But fear does not mean weakness. Fear means you have something worth protecting." Her tears spilled again, but this time they were not only tears of sorrow. She looked at him, at the man who had risked his life for her when he had no reason to, and she felt something strange stirring inside her. Gratitude, trust, perhaps even hope. She whispered, "You should have been enemies, but now you are all I have." He shook his head slowly. "Not enemies, brothers. He was my brother, and through him, you are my family too." The words wrapped around her heart like a lifeline. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel as though the world was collapsing under her. Instead, she felt the faint beginnings of something new, fragile but alive. The nights continued to bring danger. Soldiers passed near her house, their shadows long against the firelight. Once, stones were thrown against her walls, but each time the human stood in the doorway, blade in hand, his figure firm against the darkness. Each time, the threat melted away into the night. The villagers watched in silence, some with fear, some with shame, as one man, An outsider, a human, stood to defend a widow when her own people turned away. One evening, when the air was heavy with the scent of rain, she stood beside him at the door. The sky flashed with lightning, and thunder rolled across the hills. She whispered, "Why do you not rest? Why do you not leave this place behind?" He looked at her, his face lit briefly by the lightning's glow. "Because this is where my promise lives. Until I draw my last breath, I will not abandon you." She felt her knees weaken, her heart pounding painfully. She closed her eyes, whispering, "You sound like him." The soldier's expression softened. "No, I only try to honor him. But I am not him. I cannot take his place." Her chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to say he had already begun to fill the hollow space left behind, but her grief held her back. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe not. But still, you carry his spirit." The storm raged outside, but in her home, she felt a warmth growing that no thunder could break. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in the village began to fade. Fear of the human's blade kept enemies away, and slowly the people grew quieter. They still watched, still judged, but none dared raise a hand against her again. And through it all, the soldier remained, repairing her walls, sharing her meals, sitting by the fire in silence when words were too heavy to speak. The widow often found herself looking at him when he did not notice. At first, it was only curiosity. Then it became comfort. And finally, it became something she could not name. Something that carried both the pain of her loss and the fragile promise of a future she never thought possible. One morning, as dawn touched the hills and the light spilled into her home, she walked outside and saw him standing by the grave again. His hand rested on the soil, his head bowed. She stood beside him, her cloak brushing against his arm. Together, they looked at the grave in silence. She whispered, "You are not forgotten, not by me, not by him." The soldier's eyes lifted to hers, steady and unwavering. "And you never will be." The funeral that had begun with loneliness ended with unity. She had stood in sorrow, abandoned by her own people, but now she stood with someone who carried her grief as if it were his own. The thread of loyalty, sacrifice, and memory bound them together. Two hearts broken by war, yet stronger when joined. And though the world still held danger, the widow no longer faced it alone. She carried both the memory of her husband and the living bond of the man who stayed. And from the ashes of loss, a new future began to take shape.